what if the greatest conflict of the 20th century never ignited at all? Picture a world where the gunshot in Sarajevo never echoes, where alliances never detonate, where empires don't collapse overnight. Imagine a timeline in which the war that shaped borders, destroyed dynasties, accelerated technology, and redefined global power simply doesn't happen. No trenches, no mass mobilization, no global trauma. Just an open path wide, unstable, and full of unpredictable consequences. In this story, we break down how the world might have evolved if World War I never erupted, how Europe's empires would survive longer, stronger, or dangerously unstable, how technology and industry would transform without the pressure of total war, how the balance of global power in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East would shift, how the absence of WW1 would reshape ideology, revolution, and the rise or fall of movements that changed everything. And finally, how today's world might look under a completely different geopolitical gravity. Lean back and enjoy. In this alternate timeline, the moment that defines everything is painfully small. The assassination attempt in Sarajevo fails. The motorcade never slows. The driver never makes the wrong turn. And Gavrilo Princip never gets his accidental shot. The Archduke leaves Bosnia annoyed, not dead, and Europe exhales without realizing what it just avoided. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, humiliated by persistent nationalist agitation, still wants to punish Serbia, but without a martyr, without public outrage, without that emotional trigger. Vienna hesitates. Diplomats push for investigation instead of invasion. London, Berlin, Paris, everyone senses tension, but nothing snaps. Europe remains a crowded room full of loaded guns, but no one pulls the first trigger. Because that spark never ignites. The alliance system stays dangerous but dormant. Germany keeps pressuring Austria-Hungary to be firm, but not enough to start a continental war. France continues its quiet military buildup, but without the urgency that fear creates. Russia still watches the Balkans like a hawk, but it doesn't mobilize millions of soldiers on its borders. The entire continent lives in a strange, uneasy, calm, unstable, competitive, but not catastrophic. This delay changes the psychological climate. Politicians behave cautiously. Generals aren't yet dreaming of glory, and the public isn't bracing for conflict. Europe is competitive, loud, proud, but restrained. Without a general war in 1914, the first major ripple hits nationalism inside the fading empires. Austria-Hungary keeps struggling to hold its dozens of ethnic groups together. Without the unifying effect of war, separatist movements grow bolder. Croats demand more autonomy. Czechs push for federalization. Hungarians fight for more power. The empire becomes a political minefield, a giant mosaic cracking at the edges. Meanwhile, Russia faces increasing pressure from its own population. Workers demand reforms. Peasants demand land. Radicals demand revolution. Without the distraction of war, the Tsar has no external enemy to blame. His problems stare him in the face. Germany, on the other hand, benefits first. No war means no costly mobilization, no naval blockade, no starvation, no economic collapse. Industrial output keeps climbing, technology keeps advancing, and the young German Empire enters the late 1910s as Europe's most efficient powerhouse. The Kaiser feels validated. His navy keeps expanding, his global ambitions stay alive, and he sees himself as the modern architect of peace, at least on the surface. But below this illusion, Germany's rivals grow anxious. Britain watches Germany's industry overshadow its own. France fears that every extra year of German growth puts it further behind. The continent avoids war, but not the competition that fuels it. The Balkans become the pressure cooker of the entire world. Without a major war to reset borders, Serbia continues rising, building influence among Slavic populations inside Austria-Hungary. Tensions simmer as both sides play a long, dangerous chess match. The Ottoman Empire, still weakened, but not yet carved up by global powers, clings to its remaining land while reforming at a snail's pace. Every nation senses that the region could explode again. But without the Sarajevo shock, diplomacy buys time. Long enough for some players to grow stronger and others to grow desperate. This era, 1914 to 1918, in our real world becomes something entirely different here. A period of rivalry, half-reforms, rising nationalism, and accelerating industrial power. The world believes it dodged disaster. Newspapers talk about a new era of diplomacy. Leaders congratulate themselves. People go back to living, building, dreaming. But beneath that fragile optimism lies an uncomfortable truth. Avoiding World War I doesn't remove the causes that almost triggered it. It only delays them. Tensions evolve in silence, pressures intensify, and the balance of power begins shifting in ways no one truly understands yet. The world is calm on the surface and unstable underneath. What happens to a century when its first great fracture never occurs? In a world without World War I, the early 1900s become a decade stretched unnaturally wide, full of pressure that never finds a release. Empires stand tall long after their foundations start to crack, and decisions once forced by desperation now drift into uncertainty. The European balance of power becomes a strange, frozen arrangement where rival nations grow stronger without ever being humbled. Germany expands its industry aggressively. Russia pushes modernization harder, and Britain desperately tries to protect an empire it can feel slipping. The world becomes louder, richer, more crowded, and more ambitious, but never safer. All the unresolved tensions stack like dynamite left in a warm room, and the map of Europe transforms into a pressure chamber waiting for someone reckless enough to open its door. Without trench warfare draining manpower and money, the colonial machine accelerates instead of collapsing. Germany pushes deeper into Africa with vast infrastructure projects, determined to rival Britain's global footprint. France fortifies its empire in North Africa, focusing on economic extraction instead of military survival. The Ottoman Empire, which historically fell apart during the war, holds on far longer than expected. Reformers try to modernize it piece by piece: railways, telegraphs, coastal defenses. But corruption, internal divisions, and ethnic tensions continue to rot the structure from within. With no global conflict to expose the system's weakness, the decay hides beneath layers of ceremonial stability. The Balkans remain the continent's live wire, nationalist movements growing louder each year. Instead of detonating in 1914, they simmer, spread, and intertwine with foreign interests, turning southeastern Europe into a geopolitical minefield. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand still happens, but without the alliances set on hair-trigger alert, it becomes a regional crisis rather than a global unraveling. Austria-Hungary uses the event to justify cracking down harder on nationalist groups, leading to mass arrests and tighter political controls across its territories. Instead of collapsing under wartime pressure, the dual monarchy limps forward through brute authority, suppressing identity movements it can no longer understand or negotiate with. Serbia becomes a symbol of resistance across the Balkans, drawing sympathy from Russia, volunteers from neighboring Slavs, and quiet funding from nations hoping to weaken Vienna's influence. Europe watches the confrontation like spectators at a chess match, knowing a single wrong move could still ignite something far larger. But because no alliance system is activated, the crisis drags on, unresolved, poisoning every diplomatic relationship involved. Germany, untouched by war and driven by industrial momentum, becomes the world's technological powerhouse by the 1920s. Massive steel production, chemical innovation, and early automotive expansion push it into an economic golden age. But with power comes overconfidence. Berlin's leaders begin to imagine the nation as Europe's natural coordinator, encouraging pro-German influence in smaller states while quietly undermining rivals. Britain observes all this with escalating anxiety. Without the war to weaken it, the British Empire remains enormous, but financially strained and increasingly paranoid. Naval rivalry with Germany intensifies, each unveiling new dreadnoughts and advanced cruisers in a race without visible purpose. France, surrounded by giants and still traumatized by past conflicts, fortifies itself economically, diplomatically, and psychologically. A peacetime arms race emerges, silent, expensive, and globally destabilizing. Russia's fate becomes one of the strangest divergences. With no catastrophic war defeat, the Tsarist regime doesn't collapse in 1917. Instead, reforms arrive slowly, pushed by advisors who warn that modernization is the only way to prevent eventual ruin. The empire industrializes heavily, expands railway networks, and attempts to integrate its massive population into something resembling a coherent modern state. But corruption, famine, and inequality remain unresolved. Lenin's revolutionary movement doesn't disappear. It mutates. Rather than a sudden uprising, it becomes a long, grinding ideological insurgency, spreading through factories, universities, and rural villages. The Russian Empire turns into a battlefield of ideas, a place where modernization and revolution clash for decades instead of months. Europe fears not a communist takeover, but a slow implosion that could spill instability across the continent. The United States, untouched by world conflict, grows into a superpower much earlier. Without mobilization for a European war, American industry redirects its output toward consumer goods, transportation, and early communication technologies. Immigration remains high, fueling enormous population growth and cultural expansion. By the late 1920s, the US, the new, dominates global trade routes, outselling European manufacturers in dozens of markets. But this dominance also breeds resentment. Britain views America as an economic rival, Germany sees it as an obstacle to industrial supremacy, and France fears becoming dependent on American imports. With no shared wartime alliance to unify them, the Western powers begin competing openly for markets, resources, and political influence. The world economy becomes a high-speed race between nations unwilling to cooperate, setting the stage for far more volatile crises later in the century. The global cultural landscape shifts in unpredictable ways. Without the trauma of WWI, the lost generation never forms, meaning literature, philosophy, and art evolve differently. European intellectuals remain more optimistic, more idealistic, less God. Futurism becomes the dominant artistic movement, glorifying speed, machinery, and technological triumph. Cities expand vertically as nations compete to build the tallest skyscrapers and fastest rail networks. Early cinema explores grand utopian visions instead of post-war disillusionment. But beneath this brightness lies something darker. The absence of tragedy allows nationalism to mature unchecked. Propaganda grows more sophisticated, more glamorous, more appealing. Political movements across Europe harness aesthetics and technology to build loyalty. Without the memory of mass death to warn them, entire populations drift toward ideologies that promise national greatness at any cost. The global cultural landscape shifts in unpredictable ways. Without the trauma of WWI, the lost generation never forms, meaning literature, philosophy, and art evolve differently. European intellectuals remain more optimistic, more idealistic, less God. Futurism becomes the dominant artistic movement, glorifying speed, machinery, and technological triumph. Cities expand vertically as nations compete to build the tallest skyscrapers and fastest rail networks. Early cinema explores grand utopian visions instead of post-war disillusionment. But beneath this brightness lies something darker. The absence of tragedy allows nationalism to mature unchecked. Propaganda grows more sophisticated, more glamorous, more appealing. Political movements across Europe harness aesthetics and technology to build loyalty. Without the memory of mass death to warn them, entire populations drift toward ideologies that promise national greatness at any cost. Asia evolves dramatically differently as well. Japan expands aggressively across the Pacific, but without the distraction of a global war. Western powers are much quicker to push back diplomatically. China's internal struggles intensify. Without European weakness to exploit, regional warlords fight longer and harder for control. India sees an earlier push for independence as Britain's overstretched empire tries to maintain authority. The Middle East remains under Ottoman influence longer, delaying many of the borders and conflicts that historically emerged after the empire's collapse. Global alliances shift constantly, forming and dissolving based on trade, modernization, and strategic interests rather than wartime loyalties. A world without WW1 becomes a world defined by competition rather than reconstruction. And competition, when stretched too far, creates its own catastrophes. Economically, the world becomes dangerously interconnected. Without wartime destruction, financial markets grow rapidly and recklessly. Investment bubbles form across railways, colonial projects, and industrial ventures. When the inevitable crash hits in the late 1920s, it hits harder than in our timeline. The Great Depression becomes deeper and longer, for there is no wartime solidarity, no unified alliances, no shared trauma to pull nations together. Instead, governments respond with fierce protectionism. Tariffs rise, borders tighten, and global trade contracts violently. Massive unemployment drives political extremism, but without the memory of World War, populations are far more willing to gamble on radical leaders who promise stability. The world does not descend into total war, at least not yet, but the foundations of later conflicts become far more unstable, far more explosive. By the late 1930s, the world stands at a crossroads built by decades of unresolved pressure. The absence of WW1 didn't prevent conflict. It merely shifted the timeline. Nations are wealthier, prouder, more technologically advanced, and far more paranoid. Colonial empires are overstretched, ideological movements are stronger, and economic fractures cut deep across continents. Everyone senses that something massive is approaching, but no one knows its shape. There is no Hitler, no Versailles Treaty, no wounded Germany fueling a single fanatic movement. But there are dozens of rising powers, each convinced it deserves more. The world becomes a mosaic of rival ambitions, each one too powerful to ignore and too stubborn to coexist peacefully. It is a century built on pressure without release, and pressure always finds a way to explode. Without the shockwave of a global war, the 1920s evolved into a decade of aggressive imperial consolidation rather than cultural liberation. The British Empire expanded its administrative grip instead of slowing down, fueling internal pressure across India, South Africa, and Egypt. Germany poured its industrial strength into vast transportation corridors, linking Central Europe to the Balkans, aiming to dominate resource flow without ever crossing the threshold into conflict. Russia, still under Tsarist rule, found itself torn between modernization and rigid monarchy, its urban centers simmering with movements that lacked the world-altering trigger of total war. Across oceans, the United States remained powerful but not defining, watching Europe grow into a web of rival empires locked in economic competition rather than military destruction. The absence of World War I meant no dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Instead, Vienna became the heart of a fragile yet ambitious multi-ethnic bloc, attempting reforms to keep pace with industrial Europe. Economic councils replaced military alliances, but internal fractures remained tense. Without the war's devastation, technological progress came slower, yet far more uneven, driven mostly by imperial governments rather than private innovators. Airships remained the dominant mode of long-range travel, their influence stretching from Berlin to Constantinople. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire fought to stabilize its weakening structure through ruthless centralization, suppressing rising Arab nationalism before it could fully ignite. This produced a Middle East that remained under imperial control, delaying independence movements and reshaping the geopolitical foundations of the coming century. In Africa, the consequences of a warless world crystallized dramatically. With no European collapse, colonial rule intensified rather than retreated. Germany retained its African colonies and expanded commercial infrastructure aggressively, competing with Britain and France for mineral dominance. Indigenous resistance movements grew stronger, but lacked the global shifts that in our timeline empowered them. The scramble for influence remained brutal, yet strategically restrained, as European powers recognized that military escalation could spark the very global conflict they were trying to avoid. Across Asia, Japan expanded economically. Instead of militarily, forging trade alliances and using industrial leverage over Korea and parts of China, gradually shaping itself into an empire of markets rather than conquest. The world was increasingly interconnected, yet more suffocating, more tightly controlled, more fragile. By the early 1930s, the global order stood on a knife's edge. The economic tensions that produced the Great Depression in our timeline still emerged, but their impact struck differently. Without the war's destruction or reparations, European economies were stronger, yet dangerously overextended. Massive imperial budgets collapsed under their own weight, triggering financial crises that destabilized entire regions. Germany, Britain, and Russia all responded with authoritarian economic controls, turning trade routes into battlegrounds of influence rather than open markets. Political movements radicalized not through national humiliation, but through suffocating stagnation. Intellectuals across Europe warned that the world was drifting toward an ideological collision, one that could ultimately break the fragile peace that had lasted for decades. Social consequences grew increasingly unavoidable. Without veterans, without mass trauma, and without broken nations, the cultural transformation of the 1920s never materialized. There was no roaring decade, only a tightening imperial century. Women's rights advanced slower, tied to political reforms rather than necessity. Art movements remained confined to elite circles, lacking the explosive experimentation triggered by war's disillusionment. Urban workers, inspired by global unrest and economic instability, began demanding representation within empires that were never designed to accommodate them. In Russia, underground movements pushed closer to revolution, fueled by economic collapse rather than wartime suffering. Yet without the recruitment disasters and frontline mutinies of our timeline, the foundations of the monarchy remained stubbornly intact, creating a powder keg with no clear spark. By the mid-1930s, the world was transforming into something strangely familiar, yet fundamentally altered. The absence of World War I did not prevent global conflict. It simply delayed and reshaped its path. Empires were no longer expanding. They were cracking, slowly and noisily. Every nation sensed that the balance could not hold forever. Economic collapse strained alliances, ideological extremism spread through frustrated populations, and ambitions that had once been safeguarded by diplomacy began slipping out of control. Historians in this alternate timeline would later argue that the world had merely postponed its reckoning. The question was no longer whether a global rupture would happen, but what shape it would take when the system finally failed. By the early 1960s, a world without World War I had matured into an era defined by confidence, competition, and restrained ambition. The empires that survived the 20th century intact: Britain, the Ottomans, Austria-Hungary, were no longer static relics, but modern power blocks undergoing aggressive reform. Their stability shaped a geopolitical climate where no single ideology dominated, and instead, rival models of progress clashed. Imperial capitalism, technocratic monarchies, and an industrialist-driven Russian Federation. Without the scars of global war, population growth surged, cities expanded vertically, and governments poured unprecedented resources into engineering, energy, and medicine. But this prosperity carried a shadow. Beneath the polished surface, older ethnic tensions simmered, and every major power had begun quietly assembling secret research programs, convinced that the next defining conflict would be technological, not military. The absence of the Great Depression had created a global economy that surged with unchecked momentum. Corporations grew into hybrid political engines, influencing entire regions with their supply chains and research investments. American manufacturing spread across continents, fusing with European imperial markets and Ottoman trade networks in a way that made economic borders effectively irrelevant. Yet this interconnected world also magnified vulnerability. A disruption in one empire rippled instantly across others, and leaders feared the first true global collapse might strike not through war but through systemic overload. To prevent this, the major empires convened the Grand Economic Council in 1964, establishing the closest thing the world had to an international regulatory system. However, its authority was fragile. Every empire attended with a smile while simultaneously sabotaging competitors behind the scenes. Cooperation in this world existed only until advantage appeared. The technological race of the late 1960s became the defining battleground of the era. Without two world wars diverting resources or destroying infrastructure, scientific institutions experienced half a century of uninterrupted development. Computing advanced far earlier. Aerospace engineering matured faster, and genetics research entered its first serious phase. The Ottoman Empire surprised the world by funding a vast network of desert-based observatories and high-altitude laboratories, determined to prove its scientific relevance. Meanwhile, the British Empire, still wealthy from its protected global markets, pursued early satellite communication systems, creating the first prototypes of a worldwide broadcasting grid. The United States, unfettered by large-scale military spending, poured funding into university superlabs, chasing breakthroughs in artificial reasoning. By the early 1970s, ideological alliances formed not around governance, but around access to resources and technology. Austria-Hungary led the Central Innovation Bloc, a coalition built on scientific exchange agreements that spanned from Prague to Belgrade. Their ambitions centered on nuclear energy, which they viewed not as a weapon, but as the ultimate economic stabilizer. Russia countered by establishing the Industrial Sovereignty Pact, promoting nationalized technological development insulated from foreign influence. Their focus drifted toward automation, metallurgy, and large-scale environmental engineering. Meanwhile, Britain and the United States collaborated on the Atlantic Research Compact, funding early digital networks and pushing humanity toward global information integration. These alliances, while framed as peaceful, carried a competitive edge. The absence of World War I also meant that cultural development unfolded without the trauma-driven breaks seen in our timeline. Art movements blended rather than rebelled. Modernism matured slowly. Realism never died, and music evolved through cross-imperial influences rather than ideological schisms. The 1970s produced a world rich with aesthetic diversity. Ottoman futurism, British neoclassicism, Russian industrial romanticism. Cities became showcases of architectural experimentation, with megastructures rising beside preserved imperial landmarks. This cultural harmony, however, masked deeper tensions. Intellectual freedom varied drastically between empires, and dissidents increasingly used emerging electronic networks to criticize governments. Their messages spread across borders faster than authorities could censor them. In doing so, they unintentionally revealed the world's unspoken truth. Despite peace, the foundational power structures of the old empires were aging. As global communication expanded, the first synchronized political movements emerged. Students in Boston exchanged strategies with reformists in Vienna. Journalists in Alexandria shared encrypted reports with activists in Moscow. The idea of a connected public consciousness shook governments more than any military threat. Britain attempted to form cultural councils to channel youth energy into state-sanctioned projects, while the Ottomans pushed strict information licensing. Russia, confident in its industrial model, underestimated the effect entirely. By 1977, the world witnessed the rise of the global reform wave, a loosely aligned movement demanding transparency, scientific ethics, and an end to imperial monopolies. It lacked a central leader, yet its energy was electric. The empires responded unevenly. Austria-Hungary embraced partial reform, establishing scientific councils with citizen representation to maintain control while appearing progressive. Britain attempted a middle path, allowing limited academic autonomy but tightening economic regulation to protect its trade networks. The Ottomans, fearing fragmentation, doubled down on centralized authority and surveillance technology, deploying early computational systems to predict social unrest. Russia dismissed the movement until its factories experienced coordinated strikes that halted production across 3 major cities. These reactions set the stage for a massive geopolitical pivot, the recognition that power would no longer be defined by land or wealth, but by how quickly a state could adapt to accelerating flow of information. Peace had preserved the empires, but knowledge now threatened to remake them. And as governments scrambled to respond, a new race, the race for societal control, began. Economists warned that the empire's attempts to control information could destabilize the very systems that kept global prosperity balanced. The Grand Economic Council urged restraint, arguing that suppressing reform would stifle innovation and damage inter-empire trade. But the council itself was losing credibility. Younger nations, those absorbed into empires long ago, began questioning whether they should continue feeding the power structures of states that no longer represented them. Movements in North Africa, the Balkans, and Southeast Asia called for technological independence, demanding the right to develop their own research sectors instead of relying on imperial oversight. Their arguments were persuasive. If the world had avoided 2 global wars, why should old imperial borders still dictate progress? The question spread like wildfire. And for the first time, the big empires felt the pressure of fragmentation, not from rebellion, but from ambition. By 1979, the world approached a tipping point. Rapid technological growth had made energy, data, and expertise more valuable than land. Smaller nations realized they held leverage. Rare minerals, specialized universities, and geographically strategic hubs that empires relied on. When several of these nations coordinated a diplomatic bloc called the Sovereign Knowledge League, the balance shifted. They demanded equal influence in global research decisions, threatening to restrict corporate access if empires refused. This move shocked the old powers, who had grown accustomed to passive cooperation. Some predicted a diplomatic collapse. Others feared the emergence of a new ideological conflict. Yet what truly unsettled world leaders was the realization that the pace of history had outgrown them. Peaceful continuity had carried them far, but now the future demanded structures more flexible, more democratic, and more interconnected than the imperial age could provide. The final turning point of the decade came during the 1980 Council of Empires, held in London under immense global pressure. Instead of reaffirming traditional hierarchies, delegates cornered by public unrest, economic interdependence, and the rising influence of smaller nations agreed to a radical restructuring of global cooperation. The new framework, called the Unified Advancement Charter, established shared research institutions, transparent data networks, and a rotating leadership model that ended centuries of imperial dominance. It did not dissolve the empires, but it transformed their role from rulers to participants in a broader human project. For the first time, the world acknowledged that its greatest strength wasn't inherited power but collective progress. And as the 1980s opened, a new chapter began. One where peace, uninterrupted for generations, finally evolved into something more ambitious than stability, a blueprint for a unified technological civilization. What if the absence of World War I pushed the world into a different kind of confrontation by the late 20th century, one driven not by armies, but by ideology, markets, and accelerating technology? As the 1980s began, the three superblocks shaped by decades of uninterrupted competition, the British-led Western Coalition, the Russo-Slavic Federation, and the Ottoman Central Eurasian Alliance, were locked in a race defined by microchips, satellites, and information control rather than territorial conquest. Without the trauma of two world wars, global society entered the digital age with far fewer political fractures, but with far stronger economic rivalries. Governments poured historic funding into early computing, producing personal devices a decade earlier than in our timeline. Everyday life changed rapidly, and the question became who would dominate an interconnected world that had learned to avoid open conflict, yet never stopped competing behind closed doors. By the mid-1980s, the Western Coalition launched the Aurora Grid, an international digital backbone designed to link universities, research centers, and financial hubs. It was effectively a proto-internet, but far more centralized and regulated. Corporations grew powerful, and Britain's influence shifted from colonial weight to technological leadership. Meanwhile, the Russo-Slavic Federation answered with its own system, Spheranet, focusing on encrypted scientific collaboration and military data sharing. This fragmentation created the first major split in the global information sphere, a digital divergence rather than an iron curtain. Instead of ideological propaganda wars, nations fought for market share, technological adoption, and algorithmic influence. Teenagers in London, Warsaw, Istanbul, and Delhi were suddenly online years before the real-world 1990s, shaping culture long before globalization fully matured. Without the destruction and economic resets caused by global conflicts, multinational corporations expanded with unprecedented speed. Instead of America dominating entertainment and consumer tech, influence was spread across continents. British media giants battled Russo-Slavic animation studios, while Ottoman Eurasian cyber companies developed early handheld communicators that blurred the line between phone and computer. Global entertainment was more diverse, less shaped by one cultural powerhouse, and innovation surged. However, economic inequality also grew faster. Nations that had never undergone the rebuilding cycles of post-war Europe lacked the social systems that real-world history had forced governments to create. As the 1990s approached, the world became wealthier, more connected, but also more unbalanced, an accelerating machine with no forced pauses. By the early 1990s, a major turning point arrived. The signing of the Horizon Protocols, a treaty allowing limited interconnection between Aurora Grid, Spheranet, and the Ottoman Eurasian Silk Line network. Instead of a single unified internet, the world developed three competing digital ecosystems with different laws, cultures, and encryption standards. This created global divisions that were not based on ideology, but compatibility. People from different blocks often couldn't access the same websites, tools, or communication platforms. Yet, this fragmentation also prevented monopolies and fueled innovation. Hackers became cultural icons, acting as bridges between systems. The world had avoided world wars, but it had drifted into a new kind of digital tribalism, one that shaped identity as strongly as religion or nationality. Economic competition intensified when the Russo-Slavic Federation launched Orbiter 7, the first truly global satellite grid capable of broadcasting high-definition media to any point on Earth. Western corporations retaliated with early streaming platforms tied to the Aurora grid, giving users personalized content recommendations years before such technology emerged in our timeline. The Ottomans countered with immense desert solar farms powering supercomputers that cracked encryption at record speeds. All three blocks pushed innovation under the belief that whoever controlled digital pathways would control the future. Yet, despite rising tensions, diplomacy prevented all military escalation. The absence of world wars had taught nations that long-term survival depended on economic dominance, not conquest. Socially, the world transformed. Without the generational trauma of mass warfare, populations grew larger and more urbanized. Cities expanded vertically, especially in Eurasia and the Mediterranean. Education systems emphasized engineering, mathematics, and programming decades earlier. A young population hungry for technology unlocked creative revolutions. Earlier virtual reality experiments, wearable tech, and early versions of online avatars. Meanwhile, political activism shifted online even sooner. Digital protests across all three blocks demanded transparency, environmental regulation, and fairer access to the rapidly commercializing networks. Although governments attempted digital censorship, the interconnected nature of the networks made total control impossible. The groundwork for a more democratic digital world had begun to form, but cracks in the power structures also emerged. By the late 1990s, the major blocks faced an unexpected challenge: the rise of independent free nodes, decentralized community servers hosted by universities, activist groups, and private citizens. These free nodes served as bridges between Aurora, Spherenet, and Silkline, effectively bypassing state restrictions. Youth movements celebrated the idea of a unified digital sphere, leading to pressure on governments to reduce regulation. The absence of world wars had made populations far more confident in challenging authority. They had grown up in stability, so fear of state crackdowns was lower. Governments attempted to shut down these nodes, but the attempt only accelerated their growth. A cultural shift was underway, signaling the beginnings of an unstoppable global connection. The business world also entered a new era. Instead of Silicon Valley becoming the uncontested epicenter of digital innovation, tech capitals formed in London, Mumbai, Warsaw, Istanbul, and Toronto. Companies from these cities collaborated on ambitious mega-projects: early translation AIs, satellite-to-handheld communication links, and the first prototypes of World Channel's real-time video feeds designed to connect classrooms across continents. The competition produced rapid advancements, but also growing concerns about data privacy, digital dependency, and unequal access. Governments attempted to regulate the pace of innovation, but the market had already accelerated beyond their control. The stage was set for a massive transformation at the turn of the millennium. Approaching the year 2000, the world stood on the edge of a new frontier. Unlike our timeline's fear of Y2K, the dominant concern in this alternate world was something far more complex: the merging of systems. Pressure from citizens, universities, and corporations forced the blocs to discuss interoperability treaties. If successful, humanity would gain a unified digital space capable of accelerating science and culture beyond anything previously imagined. If it failed, economic tensions could escalate into the first major conflict in decades. After nearly a century without global war, the stakes were immense. Leaders understood that the 21st century would be defined by this choice connection or fragmentation. As midnight approached on December 31st, 1999, a symbolic demonstration unfolded. Thousands of free nodes across all free blocks synchronized and broadcast a shared message: one world, one network. It became the most watched transmission of the century. The impact was immediate. Public support for unification skyrocketed, forcing governments into emergency negotiations. The absence of World War I had created a world where conflict avoidance was a learned instinct, and now that instinct pushed humanity into the digital era united rather than divided. By early 2000, the foundations for the global mesh were approved, a historic shift that set the tone for the new millennium and reshaped every aspect of human life. The world stood at the threshold of unprecedented possibility. What unfolds when a world without World War I enters the 21st century? The early 2000s begin with an economic landscape shaped not by Reconstruction, but by decades of uninterrupted industrial competition between three great blocs: the Western Aurora Coalition, the Russo-Slavic Sphere, and the Ottoman Eurasian Confederation. Globalization accelerates earlier, driven by high-speed continental rail networks and the lack of a Cold War. Yet under this polished exterior, tensions rise in the shadows. Without the historical memory of two world wars, nations adopt a more aggressive corporate diplomacy, pushing influence through trade monopolies and communication empires. As technology advances rapidly, the blocs are more focused on dominance than cooperation, quietly building digital surveillance frameworks to gain leverage in a world where conflict has been economic, not military. The absence of the world wars dramatically reshapes the Middle East. Without Sykes-Picot and the later geopolitical fractures, the Ottoman Eurasian Confederation remains a powerful, semi-democratic union stretching from Anatolia to parts of Arabia. When the 2000s digital boom hits, the union becomes a global energy tech giant, investing early in solar megaprojects and data infrastructure. This causes a global power imbalance. The Russo-Slavic sphere becomes increasingly dependent on southern energy networks, while the Western Aurora Coalition struggles to keep up with the Confederation's rapid expansion. By 2005, instead of the Western world dominating global platforms, three competing internet ecosystems emerge, each with its own protocols, currencies, and social networks. Global culture doesn't unify, it fractures. People live in parallel digital realities, algorithmically shaped by their bloc. Technology accelerates faster, without the economic destruction of two world wars. By the mid-2000s, the Aurora Coalition launches WorldNet Spectrum, a decentralized global network meant to bypass bloc restrictions. At first, it's celebrated as a tool for universal access, but within 2 years, it becomes the most contested space in the world. The Russo-Slavic sphere floods the system with competitive AIs designed to reshape global opinion through subtle narrative shifts. while the Ottoman Eurasian Union counters with encrypted knowledge vaults meant to protect cultural heritage from algorithmic manipulation. As these systems collide, humanity experiences the first large-scale information war not through hacking or sabotage, but through competing visions of truth. Young people across the blocks begin noticing that the world looks different depending on which network they're raised on. Without World War I, Europe never fractures into the nationalist lines we know. By 2012, the continent remains a competitive mosaic of strong empires rather than a unified political project. This drastically changes how the financial crisis unfolds. Instead of a shared collapse, the downturn hits unevenly. The Ottoman Eurasian Confederation's diversified trade networks protect much of Asia and the Middle East, while the Western Aurora Coalition faces a harsh recession that sparks calls for regulatory reform. Meanwhile, the Russo-Slavic sphere uses the crisis to expand influence, offering low-interest loans to struggling regions and quickly gaining footholds in media and energy sectors worldwide. What should have been an economic challenge becomes a global shift in power. By 2015, the Russo-Slavic sphere owns key infrastructure across Europe. The Confederation dominates energy and logistics, and Aurora's influence begins to slip. Social media emerges differently in this alternate timeline. Instead of a handful of global platforms, 3 isolated megasystems dominate: Aurora Sphere, Slavalink, and Silk Social. Each operates under its block's values, shaping culture and communication. Aurora Sphere encourages open debate, but becomes chaotic and polarized. Slavalink promotes collective identity and order, creating disciplined yet heavily curated public discourse. Silk Social emphasizes cultural preservation, leading to vibrant creative communities but strict rules on political content. By the late 2010s, young people worldwide live inside digital bubbles shaped by their block's philosophy. Cultural mixing slows, misinformation becomes block-targeted, and global discourse fractures into 3 echo chambers. The world never becomes globalized in the cultural sense, only connected. The absence of shared trauma from past global wars means cooperation is always secondary to influence. The 2020 pandemic unfolds shockingly differently, without decades of international health cooperation, much of which historically grew out of the post-WI world. The global response is slower and heavily block-dependent. Each empire closes its borders and develops its own containment protocols. The Ottoman Eurasian Confederation reacts fastest, using its centralized medical infrastructure to suppress outbreaks early. The Russo-Slavic sphere enforces strict regional quarantines, relying on surveillance AIs. The Aurora Coalition suffers the hardest hit due to fragmented political decision-making. With no shared trust between blocks, data is inconsistent, vaccines are developed separately, and distribution becomes entangled in geopolitical bargaining. The pandemic does not become a unifying event, it becomes the ultimate symbol of humanity's fractured global order. By 2021, instead of emerging stronger together, the blocks emerge suspicious, competitive, and more isolated than ever. By the early 2020s, the 3-block system reaches its fragile peak. Technological progress accelerates, but political cooperation collapses. Aurora's digital democracies face internal polarization. The Russo-Slavic sphere tightens digital oversight as its population questions state narratives. The Ottoman Eurasian Confederation expands influence across Africa and Central Asia through massive energy tech investments. Humanity stands on the edge of a new era not defined by war, but by strategic rivalry. The most significant consequence of a world without World War I emerges clearly. The world avoided global conflict but also avoided global unity. The shared trauma that once pushed nations to collaborate never existed. Instead of a century shaped by rebuilding, reconciliation, and international institutions, the world grows into three self-contained civilizations, each racing toward the future on its own terms. Peace exists, but it is fragile, maintained by balance, not trust. And this brings the timeline to the present day. A world without World War I becomes a world without global cooperation, without shared historical lessons, and without the institutions that shaped our real century. It's a timeline full of brilliance and innovation, but also division. Three competing realities, three digital cultures, three visions of the future. Peaceful on the surface, uncertain underneath. And now the final question goes to you. Would humanity truly be better off without one of the most devastating conflicts in history? Or does the world sometimes need shared hardship to learn how to stand together? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. What part of this alternate world surprised you the most?